Hi, welcome to part 1 of my review of the Nikon ZFC. In this part we'll be looking at the camera's body and controls and its stills capabilities. In part 2 we'll be looking at its video features and summing up. The ZFC is one of Nikon's 3 Z-mount crop sensor or APS-C mirrorless cameras, the other two being the Z50 and the Z30. All 3 cameras share the same sensor, X-Speed 6 image processor, shutter mechanism and lens complement, so the results that can be achieved will be more or less identical. However, they are each targeted at a different group of users and deliver a different user experience. The Z30 is aimed squarely at vloggers. It has a fully articulated screen and does without either an electronic viewfinder or built-in flash. Being video-oriented, it lifts the 30-minute recording limit of the other 2 cameras, and at 350 grams, the Z30 body is the lightest of the 3. Weighing in at 395 grams, the Z50 is biased more towards the stills photographer. It has a tilting screen, an EVF and a built-in flash. Whilst it's perfectly capable of shooting video, the tilting screen is non-ideal for this use case. The ZFC is arguably the only true hybrid camera in the range, sporting both a fully articulated screen and an EVF. There is, however, no built-in flash. At 390 grams it weighs almost the same as the Z50. However, the story doesn't stop there. There are a number of other factors that set the ZFC apart from its 2 peers. First and foremost, of course, there are its retro-styled good looks. The design of the ZFC is intended to mirror that of Nikon's classic FM film camera. I don't have an FM, but I do have this Minolta XGM, and as you can see, the overall aesthetic is very similar. Although all 3 APS-C cameras have magnesium alloy construction under the skin, the ZFC's exterior features a high proportion of metallized plastic compared to the other 2, whose exteriors are mainly polycarbonate. The ZFC's top plate has multiple physical control dials that are not present on the other 2 cameras, further mimicking the look and feel of a classic film camera. Finally, another important difference is that the ZFC and Z30 have over the older Z50 is that they both have USB-C connectors supporting USB power delivery. This means that you can charge the battery whilst it's still in the camera or even power the camera via USB. This is particularly valuable when shooting video. So what's it like? Trying a camera in a store isn't a very reliable guide. It's especially difficult for mirrorless models when the battery of the display unit is flat and you can't see anything through the viewfinder. Consequently, when I first unboxed my ZFC, I was struck by the hard leather textured plastics, which made it feel like a cheap plastic toy, and there was a moment when I seriously considered sending it straight back. Fortunately, this feeling didn't persist once I'd attached a lens, charged and installed the battery. In fact, I then experienced something that was quite the opposite in nature. The ZFC is a very similar size and shape to my first film SLR, a Fuji ST605N, and a kind of muscle memory kicked in with it feeling very familiar in my hands. I did have a small number of concerns, so once the battery was fully charged, I went straight to putting these to rest. The first of these was the electronic viewfinder. Composing my shots with a tiny computer monitor wasn't something I was looking forward to. I have to say though that Nikon has done an excellent job with the ZFC's EVF, which provides as natural an experience as you might reasonably expect. It's only really let down by the refresh rate, which can't keep up when you move the camera quickly. I'd also prefer a tad more resolution, but 2.3 million pixels is pretty much standard for a camera in this price bracket. Next, I tested the video autofocus. This was one of the main reasons I was replacing my old DSLR. The ZFC passed my video autofocus tests with flying colours. Where my old D5300 would continuously hunt, it simply acquired my face and tracked me confidently, regardless of where I was in the frame. This was a big win. Finally, I looked at sensor resolution. At just under 21 megapixels, the ZFC sensor is about 15% less than my old D5300, and I was curious to see if this would be noticeable in the resulting images. I'm pleased to say that even with pixel peeping, there was no significant difference in image quality that I could detect. With these three concerns put to rest, I was ready to put my ZFC to work. So, you've got the strap of your ZFC over your neck, and it looks for all the world like a film camera from days gone by. Unfortunately, this illusion is spoilt the moment you deploy the collapsible kit lens. Of course, I'm being unfair. The kit lens is a zoom, and if you substitute one of the 4 primes that are now available for the ZFC, the illusion is preserved a while longer. Turning to the physical controls on the camera's top plate, you'll see that there are more than you'd expect to find on most old film SLRs, but you might be surprised to learn that they don't all work at the same time. The combined power and shutter release button works in both stills and video modes. In fact, you can also shoot stills whilst recording a video. Conversely, the video record button only works when the mode selector is set to video, but it can be assigned a secondary function in stills mode. The other controls work more or less consistently across both modes. In full auto mode, only the exposure compensation dial has any effect. Switching to programmed auto, the ISO dial joins the party. The shutter speed dial is only active in shutter speed priority and manual modes. There's no aperture dial, the front command dial being used for this, but you can assign the lens's focus ring to control aperture in both aperture priority and manual modes. Unfortunately, the focus ring has no click stops, so it doesn't quite replicate the feel of an old lens. In manual mode, the exposure compensation dial does very little. It influences the metering display, but has no effect on the exposure you have set unless you have enabled auto ISO. The upshot is that you can have as much or as little of the retro experience as you wish, relinquishing those functions that you don't want to control to the camera. You can even switch to manual focusing using the lens's focus ring in combination with the focus peaking feature, or the tiny focus point in the viewfinder that switches from red to green, which is great as long as you're not red-green colorblind. Unfortunately, this retro chic doesn't come without its downsides. The controls are very crowded and some of them are not placed in the best position. I find the image play and delete buttons particularly awkward to use, especially when the screen is flipped out. I don't have particularly large hands, but even so my fingers stray onto the front function button and accidentally trigger the associated white balance menu, which is the default assignment. Disabling the button is only a partial fix, as when your fingers are resting on it, all the buttons cease to work. Another consequence of physical control dials is that there is less separation between video and stills modes. For example, with my old D5300 I could set different shutter speeds for each mode and swap between them, but this is not really possible with a single dial. This is also probably the reason that unlike the Z30 and the Z50, the ZFC doesn't offer any user-defined settings. Although overshadowed by the physical controls, the ZFC also has a touch-sensitive screen. You can use it to navigate the setup menu. In shooting mode, you can use it to select options such as the eye menu, to set the focus point and to release the shutter. In playback mode, you can swipe between images and use pinch to zoom just like a smartphone. Because it's fully articulated, you can fold it away. This not only protects it whilst it's not in use, but it also helps the ZFC look more like a film camera. The ZFC doesn't have a built-in grip, and this black leather textured plastic is both hard and slippy, so you're not going to be very comfortable holding the camera in one hand, especially if you have a long lens attached. But this isn't a new problem. I used to use this flash bracket with my old film cameras, but today there are much better solutions available. I'm aware of at least 3 different grips for the ZFC, including one from Nikon. This one from SmallRig works extremely well. It provides a comfortable grip whilst preserving the camera's retro aesthetic. Your fingers sit a little further away from the buttons, making accidental activation less likely. It also acts as an L mount, allowing you to fit the camera to a tripod in both landscape and portrait modes. As I mentioned earlier, the ZFC's viewfinder provides a fairly natural experience. not unlike that of a DSLR. This is helped by the fact that viewfinder brightness adjusts automatically in line with ambient lighting. Autofocus is fast and reliable, with multiple modes including subject tracking, face and eye detect. In fact, when it was released, the ZFC was the first APS-C mirrorless camera from Nikon to feature eye detect AF. Face and eye detection are both range limited. With the kit lens set to its widest 16mm setting, eye detect drops out at about 3.5 meters and face detect at around 7.5. This seemed a little soon to me, but my Sony RX100 Mark IV, which has a similar sensor resolution of 20 megapixels, performs much worse. It doesn't support eye detect and the face detect function drops out at around 3.5 meters. The more generic subject tracking mode doesn't fare any better at this range and decided to lock onto a tree. I imagine it would probably cope better with a less cluttered background. Despite this range limitation, I do find subject tracking very useful. Rather than use the old technique of pressing the shutter button halfway down to lock focus and then recompose, I quickly found myself selecting subject tracking, which was both easier to use and more consistent than my old D5300. The control I find myself using most is the exposure compensation dial, so it's fitting that this is the one that works in almost every mode. It makes it very easy to compose a shot with either the screen or the viewfinder and tweak the exposure until you see the result you want. This is especially true for nighttime shots like this one of the Savoy Palace Hotel in Madeira, where you want to preserve the atmosphere. One annoyance with this dial is that unlike the other two, it has no locking mechanism, and it's too easy to accidentally change values. I've now trained myself to check exposure compensation every time I pick up the camera. The ISO dial works in one of two modes. If auto ISO is off, it defines the ISO setting in every mode except full auto, where auto ISO is mandated. If auto ISO is on, the camera attempts to honour the selected ISO value, but will use a higher value if it needs to. You can also configure a maximum ISO value that the camera will not exceed. The use of auto ISO and the associated maximum ISO value are configurable separately for stills and video modes. The ZFC is available in various kit forms, including body only and multiple lens options. If you think you might buy both kit zooms, then you should seriously consider purchasing them with the camera as part of a kit, as this will save you around £150 compared to buying later. When the ZFC was launched, many reviewers complained about the lack of lens choice, but today there are 8 lenses that are more or less dedicated to Nikon's mirrorless APS-C range. There are the 2 kit zooms that I've just mentioned. There's also an 18 to 140mm zoom that we could call a travel zoom. It's a sort of one-size-fits-all lens that you can leave on the camera pretty much all of the time. Most recently, there's the 12 to 28mm super wide-angle power zoom aimed at vloggers. None of Nikon's Z-mount APS-C cameras have in-body stabilization, but all of these zoom lenses include Nikon's vibration reduction optical image stabilization that, depending on the lens, gives you between 4.5 and 5 stops of improvement. I have the 2 collapsible kit zooms. The 16 to 50 is very good for a low-cost lens built mainly of plastic. I'm less impressed by the 50 to 250 zoom, which suffers from a tad more vignetting than I'd like. In addition to these 4 zooms, there's also 4 prime lenses. A bright f1.7 24mm DX lens that gives a full frame equivalent of around 35mm. An f2.8 26mm pancake lens, an f2.8 28mm lens, and an f2.0 40mm lens. None of these are stabilised, but that's less of an issue with shorter focal lengths. The last 3 are suitable for both FX and DX cameras. Whilst this is true, owners of DX bodies such as the ZFC will experience better corner performance. Like almost all digital cameras, the ZFC can record in both JPEG and RAW format. It also provides the option to record both at the same time. If you're shooting JPEGs, you have the choice of 3 different sizes: large, which at 5568 by 3712 pixels uses the full size of the sensor. Medium, which is 4176 by 2784 pixels, and small, which at 2784 by 1856 pixels is 1/4 sensor resolution. Normally, you'll want the highest resolution possible. However, I find medium is useful for platforms such as eBay that impose a limitation on file size, and small might be all you need for social media posts. There are 3 quality options: basic, normal, and fine. Personally, I can't see why you'd want to reduce the quality unless you really need the extra compression to reduce file size. There are also 3 image area settings that affect both size and aspect ratio. This setting is available in both JPEG and RAW shooting modes. For large files, the DX setting uses the full sensor resolution with an aspect ratio of 3:2. The other 2 settings crop the image in order to achieve different aspect ratios. In large mode, the 1:1 option produces square images of 3712 pixels a side, and the 16:9 setting produces widescreen images of 5568 by 3128 pixels. When shooting JPEGs, the colour rendering of the resultant image depends on the picture control that's been selected. In full auto mode, the camera uses the auto picture control, where the image is tweaked depending on the type of scene detected. Whilst this provides a very natural looking result, to my eye it does seem to lack a little punch, so you might want to consider the landscape and vivid options in one of the other shooting modes. In any mode other than full auto, you can select any picture control, including auto itself. If desired, you can edit these either in camera or with Nikon's picture control utility to create up to 12 user-defined controls of your own. This allows, for example, the use of film simulation recipes similar to those that Fuji users are used to. When shooting RAW, there are no size or quality options, and the selected picture control has no effect on the resulting RAW file. But you can apply these options retrospectively, again either in camera or using the RAW processing feature of Nikon's NX Studio application. Here's a picture that I processed with a variety of different picture controls, so you can see what the results look like. I downloaded a Kodak Gold film simulation from the internet and just for fun loaded my film camera with a roll of the real thing so that I could compare the two. I wouldn't say the results looked the same, but the ZFC's rendition was certainly pleasing. Flash photography with the ZFC is actually quite a big topic. Big enough that it could justify its own video. But in this review I'm just going to stick to the basics. Firstly, as I mentioned earlier, the ZFC does not have a built-in flash. So if you need to perform flash photography, you'll need to buy a separate unit, and these are not cheap. Nikon's entry-level model is the SBR200, which retails in the UK at around £179. You should expect to pay at least £90 for an aftermarket brand. If flash is important to you, you should factor in the associated cost and the inconvenience of a separate unit into your purchasing decision. In full auto shooting mode, there are only 2 real flash options available: fill flash and red eye reduction. The flash off option seems a bit redundant when using a separate unit with an actual physical on-off switch. There are 3 other flash options that are enabled when you switch between shooting modes. Rear curtain sync is available in every shooting mode except full auto. Slow sync and slow sync plus red eye reduction are only available in programmed auto and aperture priority shooting modes. Fill flash is the normal mode of operation. The flash fires when the front shutter curtain opens. Conversely, rear curtain sync combines a low shutter speed with firing the flash when the rear shutter curtain closes. This allows you to, for example, capture light trails behind a moving subject. Red eye reduction is basically the same as fill flash and operates by performing 3 initial flashes to get your pupils to contract before taking the picture. Slow sync lowers the shutter speed to better capture background lighting in low light levels. A key thing to understand about flash photography is how it can affect shutter speed. The ZFC's flash sync speed maxes out at 1/200th of a second, and for older flash guns such as my SB400, simply switching on the flash will force a shutter speed of less than or equal to this value. Use of the slow sync or rear sync options enables even lower shutter speeds. If you have a more recent flash gun, such as the SBR200, which implements Nikon's Auto FP high speed mode, then the ZFC's highest shutter speed of 1/4000th of a second is supported. Flash exposure compensation allows you to adjust the relative amount of flash used by +1 or -3 stops. In addition, there are configuration options that allow you to adjust the flash sync and associated shutter speed, how flash exposure compensation is metered, and how auto ISO works with respect to the subject and the rest of the frame when using flash. This gives you a fair amount of creative control when using flash, but it does seem to make things rather complicated. That's all I have to say about the stills features of the ZFC. In part 2, I'll be talking about its video features and summing up. While I was putting the finishing touches to this review, Nikon announced the Z50 Mark II. To my mind, this camera has a number of standout features. First, there is of course the X-Speed 7 image processor. This brings a whole raft of autofocus improvements, including new subject recognition modes and 3D tracking. For video shooters, we have the fully articulated screen, a headphone jack for monitoring audio. This, I think, is a first for a Nikon APS-C camera. And last, but not least by any means, is the ability to record video in log format. What this means for the ZFC is that we can no longer think of it as the best video and stills hybrid camera in Nikon's APS-C range. That crown now passes to the Z50 Mark II. But these improvements don't come without a cost. First, there's weight. The Z50 Mark II weighs 100 grams more than either the ZFC or the outgoing Mark I model. Next, there's power consumption. Even though the Z50 Mark II ships with the new EN-EL24A battery, its CPA rating drops from 300 shots per charge to just 250. Still, it's an interesting camera and worthy of consideration. I hope you enjoyed this video. That's all from me.